Thank you for having me at this very interesting conference. I would like to speak today about a topic that I have been dealing with for more than 4 years now, and a topic that has become a sort of starting point of my academic career and was also a sense of my dissertation thesis. About 4 years ago, I have defended this thesis called the Communist Party of Austria and Communist Reformism in Czechoslovakia. And I must admit, initially my research project was based on methodological approach widely known as comparative studies of communism or just communist studies. And my original intention was to reconstruct the relationship of one communist party to another, as well as to clarify in such an empirical way the connection of the Austrian communists to the Prague Spring. So back then I was drawn to particularity of Prague Spring as a distinctive, unique historical event which cannot be separated and reconstructed outside its own Czechoslovak context. But, however, the tendency of my research quickly reshaped and took a far more subtle form of intellectual history. This shift in the very nature of inquiry has led me to the following clarifications. Above all, it is necessary, at least it seems to me, to perceive the Prague Spring as a process of a major intellectual complexity and derived from a contradiction democratic experience of a Central Europe. Not just a set of events of pure political nature or even just one event. So the Prague Spring surely could be interpreted as a significant link in the chain of European reform communism. In such position, the Prague Spring revealed its potentialities, revealed all the potentialities of the European Marxist tradition, while being also a form of utopian avant-garde for the future. As a process, in the open-ended and utopian scheme, the Prague Spring have communicated with different layers of a historical memory and a historical Marxist tradition and historical methods for the struggle for emancipation, and thus established a certain form of historical continuity. As such, Prague Spring is also a transnational phenomenon, an inherently transnational phenomenon, a form of collective post-Stalinist social and political praxis with many actors as its intellectuals, creators, agents and pioneers in the era of post-Stalinism. While I would like to stress out, while not all these actors are necessarily Marxist or communist, we included among them all those who connected their own political thesis and with the effort of the Prague Spring. For example, the politician for the Österreichische Volkspartei, the Austrian People's Party, perceived a Prague Spring as a project that opened up a space for the application of the so-called Habsburg myth. Revealing the Prague Spring as a form of process or continual political praxis required also acquisition of some theoretical concepts. As particularly inspiring is the thesis of Gaspar Miklos Tamás, who referred Marxism not as a form of a certain ideological code, but rather a form of genre or a topos, reproducing and replicating itself in a variety of distinctive ideological forms throughout the time and space. Based on Tamás' topological characteristic of Marxism, I'm also applying the concept of so-called Marxist episteme, which is inspired by renowned theory of episteme developed by Michel Foucault. And by Marxist episteme, I mean Marxism as a mode of intellectual production and replication, Marxism as a certain intellectual universe, again, rather than rigid ideological code. In such a universe of Marxist episteme, all distinctive ideological figures of Marxism are enabled to intersect with each other, and altogether they form a kind of intellectual synchronicity. They are intertwined in such a way, rather than being a state of conflict and disparity. So the whole concept of Marxist episteme enabled us to think about the relation of Austro-Marxism and integral socialism to the reform communism and the Prague Spring projects. And finally, which helped me a lot, was a notion of American political theorist Jody Dean, who clarify or depict a communist party not just like a political body, but rather as emotional structure. She shows in her work, such as The Comrade and The Communist Horizon, how very different experiences, beliefs and memories can cooperate to each other in a body of emotional structure. The application of these principles, Marxist episteme, emotional structure and so on, can be quite clearly observed on the example of Austrian communists. Because the emotional structure and the very habit of this party was significantly modified by so-called generation of February 1934, by which I mean mostly former social democrats like Franz Marek or Ernst Fischer, whose spiritual and political horizon took shape under decisive influence of Otto Bauer's Austro-Marxism and its integral socialism, despite the latest Stalinist period and its criticism. Therefore, I perceive Bauer's Austro-Marxism as a phenomenon that stands in the position of so-called significant other to the generation of 1934. This very term, significant other, according to philosophers such as Charles Taylor or Axel Honneth, refers to the archetypal father figure who, in spite of clashes and conflicts, took a position of a subconscious authority which is constantly present and it's prevailing into ideological discourse. And since the discourse of national communism had the highest priority in the Austrian communist ideological scheme, at least from 1947, when communist intellectual Alfred Klar had published his major principles regarding the independence and sovereignty of Austrian nation, there was always being questioning between Austrian communist intellectuals. Which are the driving principles and leading motifs of this national communism? On what ideological basis it can be built? As long as Stalin was alive, this question was quite clear. As Alexei Yurchak had put it in his Last Soviet Generation, Stalin himself represented an ideological canon after the cult of personality was exposed. And the International Communist Project has found itself in an urgent need to find a new legitimacy. As a result of these and other internal matters, the Austrian communists came through the continual political crisis. Since the declaration of State Treaty in 1955, their membership had drastically fallen the next year as a result of suppressed Hungarian crisis in 1956, and they finally have lost their seats at Parliament at 1959 election. It was in that process of crisis when the voice of the Austro-Marxist significant other had again come through and prevailed within the leading communist intelligentsia. Franz Marek, the leading editor of Weg und Ziel, the theoretical journal of the Communist Party of Austria, he made and elaborated a kind of synthesis between Gramscian conception of hegemony and Bauer's integral socialism. At the 19th Party Congress in 1965, we can see a triumph of a generation of February 1934. It was, without hesitance, one of the first triumphs of reform communism, not only in Central Europe, but Europe as a whole, when Austro-Marxist significant other had took a stage again and formulated a clear vision of integral democratic socialism. Back then, it was depicted as a return to Bauerian politics, as a return to the Bauer by Eastern German SED and Stasi. There was also a kind of reciprocity between Czech and Austrian left, even since the February 1934, when thousands of Austrian social democrats and communists found a new asylum in interwar Czechoslovakia. At that point, I would also like to stress out the example of Leopold Grünwald, who was a close friend to Czech-Austro-Marxists and the first chairman of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, Bohumil Šmeral, and could be aligned, among others, among fathers of both Czechoslovakian and Austrian communist movement. And during the second half of the 1960s, this Leopold Grünwald became a Czechoslovak correspondent for Austrian Volksstimme. So we can see a clear connection between Czech and Austrian Communist Party here. On the basis of so-called post-Stalinist epistemological autonomy, this new pluralist mode of coexistence and distribution of knowledge, this reciprocity, which was currently here from the half of the 1930s, has turned to synergy. The Czechoslovakian and Austrian reform communism have formed almost a case of united Central European communism as a shared project. Example of that is the renowned conference about Franz Kafka's work at the Chateau Liblice in 1963, where Ernst Fischer had advocated the cultural autonomy, the new form of socialist realism, and the freedom of speech and expression. So it leads me to the conclusion that Austrian communist intellectuals took a direct participation in Czechoslovak reformist project, not just observant and commentators and witness, but rather as a principal agents. Through text, Ernst Fischer and others, the democratic integral socialism really penetrated to the Czechoslovak reform project and helped to formulate their agenda. So I would like to summarize by the statement that Prague Spring really is an integral part of modern Austrian history, and we could speak about the kind of synchronicity of Czech and Austrian communism in Central Europe, at least from the 1965 onwards. So, thank you. Thank you for
Do you want maybe? Yes.
So, firstly, I must apologize for 3 reasons. First, for my bad English. Second, for my bad voice. And third, that I have no full text prepared for this discussion. I have some notice which try to focus on some actual outcomes of this discussion. First, I wrote 1.5 years ago, as I remember, during our first Austro-Marxism discussion, notice concerning why Austro-Marxism was not so strong in Czech left landscape between the war. My opinion is that it was not due to Marxism, it was more due to Austro. I try to explain why. first approach to this today's discussion. If we look at from the historical development, Czech, maybe not so much in Slovakia, but at least in Czech, the feeling was more or less against Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And it was connected also with this tendency to create an independent Czechoslovakia, or at least Czech state and other. And it was normal to speak about 300 years of Hungarian enslavement. It started just after that battle on Bílá hora that began 30th war, and therefore the general feeling of Czech population in October 1918 was in favor of independence, and all what at least seems to be close to Austro-Hungarian history was a little bit not so good accepted by population. I can give you one more or less family memory. My grandfather started his working career as a railway worker for Austro-Hungarian railway system before First World War. He worked in the province, in Galicia, in Poland. It was normal. Young Slavic men were sent to that eastern province, Slavic origin, and it was cheaper. Therefore, he started his career. He enlisted in the war, defended the monarchy on the Serbian front, but he was wounded, and after that he didn't return to the military services, as Austro-Hungarian monarchy needed railway running. Therefore he continued as a citizen working for this railway system. But after the war, you know, he was a little bit, how to say in English, pedant, so he tried to keep all running correctly and other. Therefore, he would like to become a soldier of the new Czechoslovak army, but as a drill sergeant, that trained soldier. But he was not accepted, however, because he did not have a strong enough negative attitude to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the Austro-Hungarian system. And when he continued as a railwayman, he had also problem with his colleague, as he worked in the South Bohemia, and he was responsible for the cross-border point Gmin, where was Czech railways continue on the Austrian land. And his colleague didn't like him, and he was able to communicate in German language with the Austrian railwaymen, and he was friendly to them. Therefore, he had also problem with that railway system. With that. It's a really concrete example, actual atmosphere in Czech or Czechoslovak society in that time. For example, now we had our minister of Karl Schwarzenberg, and in the First Republic, as we call it, was forbidden to use that noble predicate. Now it is not allowed, but on the high society you can hear Karl von Schwarzenberg when they are speaking about our Czech minister of exterior. So you can see that shifting this feeling to the Austria. Now Austria and Austrian are considered as good friends of Czech nation. On the first position is Slovakia and Slovak, what Austria is sad or forced. It means that now it's total different situation than it was in the beginning of 20s when we could speak about Austro-Marxism. Therefore, these ideas of Austro-Marxism were some in the deep of our left thinking, but officially was not mentioned.
May I just maybe interrupt you and add some remarks to the discussion, because I made quite a research about reception of Bauer's Austro-Marxism in interwar Czechoslovakia, and the problem of Czechoslovak social democracy in the 1920s was that they were facing a real crisis. Many people were fleeing to the Communist Party and preferring the communist radical vision, and so they were in urgent needs to establish their politics. And some leading social democratic intellectuals in the time, like František Modráček and others, were very skeptical about this Red Vienna project, because they were seeing it as building a bastion in an isolated land within the whole country, and it was quite opposite to the very program of Czech Social Democrats, because they were competing for the general acceptance between electorate, and according to them, Otto Bauer was a successful leader, a successful rhetor, but also a prophet of a very radical form of Marxism, which led to Vienna to be isolated within the Austrian land itself. So that was a real problem.
And the second problem was that Schmeral, you mentioned him, till 1917 he was really international, he supported a really international solution of that. So he didn't accept this tendency to constitute the independent Czechoslovakia and other. Only in the year, I think 1917, he changed a little bit approach to this question, and finally he became a one of Czechoslovak social democracy, but mainly of the left wing of this social democracy.
And also about the 1926, a major part of Czech social democratic youth, I'm speaking about youth, not like party hierarchy, they were kind of inspired by the Linz program of Otto Bauer's from 1926, but then again, in July, I think it was in July 1927, there is an upheaval in Vienna, and like justice police is burned down, and so on, and that's a kind of argument for the like more conservative social democratic intellectuals like Modráček, while they are saying again, look at the Vienna, it's like leading to nothing. It's a radical project, ambitious project, of course, but it's not suitable for the Czech lands and for the Czech democracy.
The problem was that all, as I told, my feeling is that all what came from Austria was not so clear if it can be accepted or not. And the second moment was that in that time, parallel, especially in the left part of Social Democrats, the idea of Russian October Revolution became stronger and stronger. And also,
if you ask you what was the relation of power between the Social Democrats and the Communists in the years 1920?
No, in 1920 was no communist.
In 1926.
In 1925, actually, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was the second largest party after the election. But after that, it was heavily impacted by the internal crisis, taking a peak in 1928, about 1928. And after 1928, that is the time that Klement Gottwald and his so-called Karlin boys are rising to power and then they starting to Bolshevize the party.
But it was a long-lasting process. It was not a question of one day or 1 week or 1 month. It started maybe in the 20s after this crisis with Lidový dům, the how to say, contra-attack against left movement in Czechoslovakia. As the problem was that in Czechoslovakia, if you look at previous books on this 28th October, you can see photo full of Wenzel Square with socialistický národ, socialistic nation. If you look at this book now, there is other photo without this label. I looked at that presentation of that French, and there I saw also this socialist nation in Wien. So it was general tendency after that war to think about some socialistic solution. And in the 20s, and we started with social democrat government. First two prime minister were social democrats, Tuzar and second was Titsikal, but they were not able to make some strong attack against this increasing of socialist movement in Czechoslovakia. Therefore became Černý, it was that how to say,
provisional government.
Which?
Provisional government.
Provisional government, and he had free hands, and it started a really very strong conflict, also with some ideas about Red Republic in Kladno and other. The reason was not so important. It was question who is owner of the House of Social Democrat in Ibenska, but in practice it was conflict between left solution and non-left solution of the Czechoslovak.
But what seems to me quite significant regarding this whole questions of coexistence and of Austro-Marxism and Czech social democracy in that time is the fact that Otto Bauer had developed his integral socialism in a phase to Russian Bolshevik on the other side and the clerical Austro-Fascist on the other. So he kind of balanced between reformism and radicalism, and it was not understandable for most of the Czech intelligentsia because their habits was kind of different. And I can recall the notion of a very known journalist of the time, Ferdinand Peroutka, who depicted Bauer Austro-Marxism as a radicalism without risk.
Yeah,
Radical
without risk.
It's typical Czech.
It's only radical verbally, and in a symbolical way, but in a way of political praxis, it's not a radicalism.
And you must also consider that Czechoslovakia is very strange state, as we were Czech, Slovak, but majority of, according to that origin, national origin, are German. So if you do it according actual criteria, it's very difficult to say that Czech or Slovak are the strongest. Therefore, Masaryk had to create Czechoslovak nation. Mm-hmm. In that moment, if you
consisted of two branches,
if you put it together, really majority in the state in hands of Czechoslovak nation. Second was German nation and Hungarian and Russian and other. Therefore, if there is some conflict, it was more conflict on the level of nationalities than conflict of clerical concerning this clerical situation. You know, Masaryk never liked Catholics.
This whole cultural situation of Austrian and Czech nation was quite very different.
Very different. And Masaryk didn't like Catholicism. He was what was it? He was at least Protestant or Hussite or something.
Unitarian, I think.
That was no. We are for Tábor, it's symbol of Hussite. We are not for Vatican or for that Rome. So it was, and one of the new law was law on land reform, which hasn't been never finished, but it started with very strong pressure on that land of nobles and land of church. So the conflict was in Czechia in a little bit other.
And also I would like to add something, because one of the commentators of Austro-Marxism was Ilya Ehrenburg, and in one of his books is, I think, his diary, an autobiography. He recalls a memory when he met a teacher from Vienna, actually Ukraine, I think it was in Lvov. They met each other and started a discussion about the method of Austro-Marxism. And Ilya Ehrenburg was kind of mocking at Austro-Marxism, because he had seen a teacher as an almost archetypal figure of Austro-Marxism. And he wrote down, look, in Austria they are going to do a revolution with the textbooks. Not with the guns and with the masses, but you know, they are all relying on the teachers as an archetypal figure. And in the Czech case, we had this National Socialist Party, which was heavily supported by the teachers and clerks and so on, so on, so on. So this sector of electorate was sort of covered by the Czech National Socialist, not a social democrat.
Can you just, with digression, because many people, including me, 5 minutes ago, didn't know, I mean, if you said a National Socialist, it is really the first idea are Nazis, National Socialists in Germany. Can you please tell us what is the difference, so that the people don't think that it is the same kind of ideology?
Czech National Socialist Party was established in 1897 and the very edge of the 19th century as a reaction to the official social democratic policy at the time, because social democratic policy was heavily international, and so a couple of journalists and intellectuals from the leftist rank have responded to this by developing a national project of socialism. And it was, in that time, it was inspired mainly by the Polish progressive movement of the time, the so-called postępowe, hnutí postępowe, it's Polish, I think so. And that kind of National Socialism have nothing to do with the German National Socialism of a Hitlerite type, even though you can detect some anti-Semite and xenophobic sentiments even there. But during the interwar period, the National Socialist Party was among the it was called in Czech Skupina Hradu, a party of the castle. They were defenders of the democratic system of Czechoslovakia, and they were promoting such kind of a bourgeois democratic reformism. Today we would call them leftist liberals.
Thank you, that's very important.
It's really interesting.
Sorry, one remark. So if you want to read something not so positive for Czech nationalism, you can read Rosa Luxemburg. She didn't like so much Czech leftist, and it's huge critics on the Czech. Therefore, Rosa Luxemburg is not so popular in Czech leftist now. But you mentioned that it's more complicated. You might have heard about a strike of Czech miners in 1932. It was the biggest strike in that during this crisis. Not a part of Bohemia. As there are brown coal mines, and it was one of strike relatively which won relatively in comparison in other. And it's very strange if you look at the reality. It is part of Bohemia called Sudety, where majority of population was German nationality. By the way, in the beginning of Communist Party, the biggest part of Communist Party was created as a German Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, and only under the pressure of Comintern they created one communist party, one Czechoslovak Communist Party. And this strike was organized by different left organization, and the leading organization were Communist Party of Bohemia and the Czechoslovak Communist Party, and groups of activists, workers activists from this part of German part of Czech Republic, and due to, it's my opinion, due to not so good politics of our Czechoslovak government, finally they turned into NSDAP, Deutsche
Socialistic
Arbeit Party in Sudeten, and they became as a strong supporter of how to say fifth column of Hitler regime. But it started on how to say left position, workers organization, but due to social situation and not so clever politics of Czechoslovak government, they changed their political position much closer to German. And concerning these things, also one remark, they mentioned this Karlin's boy. It was Karlin is part of Prague, and there was a headquarter of Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and it was also a question of generation changing in party. Till the 29 years, the Communist Party was in hands of, how to say, middle generation or Schmeral and others. And finally appeared the new generation of young people. Gottwald, as a new chief, was 33, as I guess, as he born in 1996, and it was 20. And the whole group were new young, mainly men, of course, who became in the leadership of Communist Party, and Schmeral, discussed when we were here, was sent to Moscow, to Kominterna, to be far from that Czech situation. Therefore, it was question. Now we are discussing that it's necessary that young people should enter into politics, and it's repeated almost 100 years after that first, only from the different position.
Maybe it's a time to give space for another questions from the audience, if anybody of you...
No, it was just a curiosity. I think that your integration on the Czech side of this national socialist movement, we can say it's an integration of the thesis of Zevsternen on the origin of fascism, like starting from the revision of Marxism made by George Sorel, more or less. I don't know. Maybe we can find some point of contact in this tendency, like a sort of international tendency.
You know, the political view of the Czech National Socialism was always eclectic. They never elaborated until 1933 the solid program, and of course they were also inspired by George Sorel and Edvard Bernstein, and they were using statesmen in arguments with social democrats, mainly. Yeah. My point was that in Austria, the situation was like that on the western part. There were like borderlands where many people was part of. They were part of this Grossdeutsche movement. You also have this mostly agrarian and Catholic countryside, and in the center of that there is a culture of Vienna, where Otto Bauer is appealing to teachers and clerks and middle class people to join the role of the social democracy and to create a better world in the Vienna. It's the so-called Red Vienna, in the point of view of Otto Bauer, it was a first step in a creating of the future communist society, the society of democratic communism, and the inhabitant of Vienna has served such a kind of example of the future man. It's a famous title of Max Adler's book Neue Menschen. This was a kind of experiment. But in the Czech Republic, the urban structure was very different. There are many local cities and many parties and local elites who are appealing to the local elites. So the situation is very different from the Austrian context.
One comment is we should distinguish between the, so to say, the heroic illusion and the real situation, because Red Vienna, so to say, was, I mean, you see all these wonderful buildings and huge achievements, of course, but it was not the result of a strategic decision. It was the result of a tactical compromise between the conservatives and the social democrats.
Yeah, that's a great point, yeah. Because we tend to make such an illusion. I have known, I didn't see it, but I have known that film, the Mr. Pym Journey to Vienna, that film from 1929, 1930, about the American journalist who is coming to Vienna to write something about all this project, and he is kind of amazed by the success of the social democratic governance over Vienna, and the whole film ends at the scenes when he is kind of witnessing the massive celebration of the first May. So it's a real propaganda of such kind. So yeah, that's a kind of heroic illusion.
And then you have the heroic illusion of the second potence, which is Max Adler. Because Max Adler was, politically speaking, a marginal person. He was an intellectual who commented on, I would say, the illusionary concept of the Austro-Marxists, while down to earth was, I mean, in 1918 the problem was that Vienna was the capital of Lower Austria. Lower Austria was an agricultural province, and the conservatives and the social democrats agreed on dividing these. And I think the conservatives were smarter than the social democrats, because the conservatives understood that if you isolate Vienna, of course you can be sure about the majority in the whole country.
There will be no change.
And the second, I think, important remark, maybe also for your doctoral thesis, the heritage of Austro-Marxism given to the Communist Party has two chapters. One chapter is the ideology, to which is normally referred because it's written and it can easily be documented. But the other thing is these more than 10,000 social democrats brought to the Communist Party the Social Democratic Party structure, which was an extremely, I mentioned this already, hierarchical and authoritarian party. And that in 1968 the Reform Communists lost is to a large degree result of the Social Democratic Party culture, which in 1934 the party was practically overtaken by the Social Democrats, and the communists were a small, the former communists were a small minority. And the former communists, they were people of all kinds, so they were anarchists, they were Zionists, they were whatever. But then when the Social Democrats came, they brought in all these. In 1945, for example, when the Communist Party was re-established, they agreed on basing it not on the traditional party structure of the Comintern, but on the organizational principle of the Social Democratic Party in the 1920s and then the 1930s. And on the other hand, you had the Marxists. So it was a battle between two
old structures and the new one, kind of.
no, not the old, but a battle between two social democratic trends: the Austro-Marxist trend and the
Standard social democratic.
And the real social democratic party culture.
Yeah, because, I'm sorry, at 1931, I think the Communist Party of Austria has something about 1,000 members, 2,000 members, I think, right after February 1934, about beginning of 1935, there were like 13,000 new members of the party, so it was like...
But I think that we should also keep in mind that in the 20s there was no any difference between aim for social democrat and aim for communist in general. It was some Marxist society without contradictory classes, but the discussion was about way to this aim. Only after that Frankfurt Congress of Socialist International became a little bit differently. So until at least, from my understanding, until at least till the beginning of Second World War, the aim was clear. When we read that idea of Bernstein, aim is nothing, the way is all, it's understanding in different way. That are the different vision, or no different vision practically for social democrat or later of communism. The discussion was how to read that.
And now you are kind of defending the thesis of the Linz program from 1926, because program was based on the assumption that we social democrats, speaking on behalf of the Bauer, we need to convince our communist comrades to come back and unite with us and create one whole party again.
So now it's totally, from my point of view, it's totally mis-explanation of the history in that mainstream media or mainstream explanation that communists were just from the beginning the evil, and the social democrat, according to who is in government, more or less acceptable, but the vision and the aim was interpretation. General was the same. One remark still. There are something also in something from Austro-Marxism also in the base of the so-called Bolshevik politics in the Czech-Austrian Communist Party, as in the mid of 30s, Czech-Austrian communists brought a new idea, unity for front against fascism. Mm-hmm. And they had a huge problem with Moscow, with Kominterna, as in the time in Kominterna still they kept class against class. And now Czech Communist Party recognized that there is no chance to survive, therefore they started to create wider political bloc against fascism.
That was when?
35, I guess.
This turn in strategy was in fact heavily impacted by the events of February 1934, because where a wave of Austrian immigrants entered the Czech borders. Right. The Czech communists began to realize there is really no way in this class against class strategy, and it is necessary to
You call this
unite.
strategy how?
It's
Class
called
against
class
class.
against class
No,
strategy.
The unit front or
It's called the popular front.
Yeah, there was not. You didn't use a Czech term.
jednotná fronta.
Jednotná.
That's right.
And it's very good book on that by Miloš Hájek. It was Reform Communist from the 68, and it's brilliant book on this politics. And small remark that Hilferding wrote in Prague when he emigrated Austria his book The Third Way. And in opposite, in 1913, Josef Vissarionovich Stalin wrote his book on Marxism and nationalism here in Wien. So and he used also this experience of national politics of Austro-Hungarian social democrat structure here. So it's also an example of historical dialectic, these two things. Therefore, it's very difficult if you look at this question concerning Austro-Marxism using actual classes. It's very dangerous. You can obtain total different picture than its reality. And I think that our aim should be also to try to show that it is not so clear as looked through the mainstream media. And my last remark is that also, as Ondřej spoke about it, that some ideas of this Austro-Marxism, or quote as Austro-Marxism, appear also in the political discussion before and during Prague Spring. And it's very important. And now is the question if it's historic moment only, or if there is something which can be also used in our actual not so easy situation. If the discussion about national politics in the left movement, if the right way do that or some mixture, and second, that some problems which are now 100 and 120 years old are on the table again now in at least European left movement, and we are standing against this question, and we are in the same situation like Kautsky and including Lenin. Yes, Lenin decided to go other way, and in that moment, I like book of Hobsbawm, that history of the 20th century, and I think that it is true that the situation was in the crucial point, and there were three ways to fascism, to communism, and something between. It means that Keynesian's economy in the time of the Great Recession. And now, my feeling is that we are on the same moment. It would be good to decide what should be good to do. And I don't know.
I think there are only two problems or two differences. First one is there are no movements we can represent, like Kautsky, Adler, and others. So it's only one small difference. And the second one, then there is no more Austria from the Austro-Marxism. So what we can debate some kind of Euro-Marxism maybe, and it's quite important debate if we prefer to be represented by the European Left Party, PS Party, and others, or by, for example, Syriza on the national level with radical program in only one country, as we know, good known, that there's not possible to organize revolution only in one country. So only two short remarks to quite interesting debate, which I prefer not to intervene in.
Yes, I think my working hypothesis when proposing the project in Austro-Marxism actually was that Austro-Marxism, so to say, is a starting point, but it's more adequate to speak on Marxism in Central and Eastern Europe. Firstly, because, as you rightly say, there is not such a thing as an Austrian center of gravity, neither intellectually nor politically. And secondly, I mean, the dialectic of the Austro-Marxist theory of nation is that on the one hand, it was the idea of creating the condition of maintaining a unitary state. But at the same time, and that's the difference between Bauer and Renner, for Bauer it was easy in 1917 to recognize that the idea of a unitary state is obsolete. So that's why in the program of the left in 1970, he just put center stage the question of the national independence, unconditionally to be recognized by Austria. But that has another side as well. I mean, if we talk now about Europe, actually, we don't know what would be the future of the European Union, of the European integration process. And frankly speaking, I now must be careful in the view of that I'm going to be next year. But frankly speaking, when talking about this idea of applying majority principle in terms of foreign and security policy, I mean, what does this mean for the little nations in Europe? Can we accept this? And if there were centrifugal forces leading to a disintegration of the European Union, what would be then the alternative? To break the thing in pieces into 27 pieces? Or would there be the necessity to think again about the regionalization of Europe and what would be the role of the left in this regional composition? And I would think that one of the reasons why we should carefully examine this tradition is the so to say the obligation of having a left in Central Europe, which at the moment practically is marginal in all its expressions. So and that's why I think reflecting on Austro-Marxism, reconstructing this culture has also a political and strategic meaning.
Very optimistic.
Yeah.
We are finishing.
With this optimistic view, then we will finish our conference. Thank you all very much. And yeah.
That was the last word.
That was the last one, yeah.